What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another Yugi-Kaiba Format video. And to sort of cap off my main exploration of the format, I'm going to be doing a tier list video. So if you missed the tier list videos that I have for some other formats on my channel, basically the way this works is I take all the decks in the format, or at least all the super unique decks in the format, and I rank them on this tier list. So let me explain what each tier means. Tier 0 is if there is one deck that is just far and away the best deck in the format, and there aren't really any other decks that can compete with that. So this tier is not always occupied, and in Yugi-Kaiba, thankfully it is not occupied, but we have it here just in case we encounter a format where there is a tier 0 deck. Tier 1 are the top decks in the metagame, the decks that are the best in the format, but none of them are super high above the others. So these are the main competitive decks in the format. Tier 2 are decks that are still competitive and can still win a fair amount of games, but they're just a bit below the power level of the Tier 1 decks. Oftentimes if you face a Tier 2 deck against a Tier 1 deck, it's going to be a bit more of a struggle for the Tier 2 deck to win. So Tier 2 decks still very good, but they're just not quite as good as Tier 1. Rogue decks are the decks that, maybe aren't good all the time, but when they actually manage to pull off their combo, they can be incredibly, incredibly good, incredibly strong. And so, they're rogue because they're not quite competitive, but they can win some games in some truly spectacular manners. And then there's trash, and trash tier is just the decks that I feel like, if you play them 9 times out of 10, you're not going to win because their win condition is so hard to fulfill, or just they don't do enough as a strategy. And so you can win with trash decks. I'm not saying it's impossible. It's just these decks so rarely accomplish their win condition that, they're not competitive in the least, really. So now that I've explained the different tiers, let's just dive right into it. So first up, we've got Stall Mill here, represented by Card Destruction. Now, Stall Mill in the last format, STYK format, which no one really plays, but I did a couple videos on it. Stall Mill in that format was a Tier 0 deck. There was just nothing that can compete with Stall Mill. The limited list in Yugi-Kaiba format, however, really hampered the deck's access to removal, and makes it so that a fair amount of decks actually can contest Stall Mill, even though it's an extremely strong strategy still. It can still win a lot of games, especially against decks that maybe aren't playing like a Summon Skull or other sorts of tribute monsters in large quantities. Those can struggle dealing with the defensive boards that Stall Mill makes, and thus won't be able to get in time before they deck out. So Stall Mill, I think, is very good. I think it's definitely in Tier 1. Moving on to another stall deck, we have Exodia. Now, Exodia is basically a stall deck that the goal of the deck is you draw 5 pieces of Exodia. And since you're only allowed to play 1 copy of each piece, this deck is not necessarily as good as some other stall decks, as it can take just way too long to actually fulfill your win condition. And if you just draw the pieces with nothing to stop your opponent's attacks, then you can just lose the game that way. There are a lot of different directions to take Exodia. Like, for instance, there's a Soul Control deck that can side into Exodia for game 2 to catch your opponent by surprise, potentially. And, there are a couple different variants of Smokescreen sides with the Exodia deck if you do want to play Exodia game 1. But I think despite all that, this deck is just Tier 2. It can't quite compete with the Tier 1 meta threats. And if it ever goes up against a Stall Mill deck, then it's pretty much an instant loss because Card Destruction can be really bad for the Exodia deck. So that's why this deck is just Tier 2. Next up, we have the first tribal strategy that we'll be featuring on this list, which is Earth Equip. Now, I showed off some videos with this deck that were rather negative. I think the deck is not the best, but, do I think it's trash? No. I think this deck falls firmly in Rogue. If it actually manages to get a monster on the field with Invigoration equipped to it, and you've exhausted a lot of your opponent's removal, then this can be pretty good. Also, being able to play Last Will in the deck makes it so that you have easy access to targets for Invigoration. So it can be pretty decent if all the stars align for you and you're able to pull off your combo and your opponent just doesn't have any ways to out it. Unfortunately, the deck also has a lot of flaws. You know, it is very easy to out a monster equipped with Invigoration if you just have like a Fisher or something. And it is a 2-card investment for a monster that is honestly not that beefy and can even die to an opponent's reinforcements. So I think that this deck is firmly rogue. But I know that my experience with it were more negative than most. So, you know, I wouldn't begrudge people ranking this potentially higher on my list. I just think it goes in rogue. Next up, we have Last Will Turbo. And Last Will Turbo is a really neat deck that I think is pretty underexplored. It got a top in one of the Yugi-Kaiba tournaments that have happened, piloted by GBO, who also really pioneered the deck. And I think the deck is very good. It basically seeks to use 3 Last Will to be able to dodge your opponent's trap holes by just bringing out more beaters, potentially bringing out monsters in defense mode if you need a defender. So I think the deck's really good. Do I think it's tier 2 or do I think it's actually tier 1? Because as I said, it's very underexplored. I think that maybe with more testing, it could potentially rise to be one of the meta threats in the format. At times like this, I really wish there was a tier 1.5, but I'm sticking to this tier list because if we get too granular with the tier rankings, then I feel like the tiers kind of lose some of their meaning. So since the deck is so unexplored, I think I am going to put it at the top of tier 2. I think that this deck could easily rise up to tier 1 potentially with more testing because it's a really, really sick deck that can really just out-aggro your opponent in a lot of cases. That being said, the deck does have a bad matchup against Stall Mill, even if it does have a pretty good matchup against one of the other tier 1 decks in the format, which we'll get to later. So that can kind of hamper its meta playability. But I think that this is at the top of tier 2 and potentially at the bottom of tier 1. Next up, we have Dragons, and I know this is a fan favorite deck in the format. It's just really fun to be able to bring out a bunch of blue eyes off of a Lord of D and Fluid Summoning Dragon. So if you do manage to pull off the combo, you feel like you're on top of the world. That being said, do I think the deck is that good? Not really. I think that it can be really inconsistent, and if you just draw all the wrong pieces to your combo, then it feels really bad, and oftentimes it can be very hard to recover. Of course, there are plenty of different directions to go with this deck. Some directions don't even play Blue Eyes White Dragon in favor of some dragons that are less bricky. Some play things like Last Will or Ultimate Offering to make sure that you get a Lord of D to stick on the field and dodge around Trap Hole a bit. I think that these help the deck potentially a bit, but despite all this, I actually think that this deck goes in Rogue. And I'm going to put it at the top of Rogue, just because when it actually does pull off its combo, it's so explosive. So while I think in most matchups against Earth Tribal would win against Dragons, I think that, you know, Dragons can win games that Earth Tribal could never dream, just because if it actually does pull off its combo, it can be insane and just win the game out of nowhere. So that's why I'm putting it at the top of Rogue. I think Dragons is like the ideal Rogue deck. Just the deck that is really not as competitive as the others, but its combo is so cool, and when it does pull off its combo, it oftentimes wins. Next up, we've got Stall Burn here, and you know, as I mentioned in my Stall Burn video, the reason I'm covering Stall Burn instead of Aggro Burn is because I think an Aggro Burn deck is just pretty much like a standard aggro deck, but one that just plays a couple burn cards as tech cards. I think Stall Burn does have its own sort of strategy and can go deeper on the burn cards than an aggro burn deck can. So that's why I'm covering this as Stall Burn instead of just Burn in general or aggro burn. And I think that Burn had a decent showing in the video that I showed off on the channel with it. Was my burn list perfect? No, probably not. Did we get very lucky game 1? Yes, we probably did. But, you know, we managed to almost win the match, and we did manage to win game 1 through burn alone. So does that make this deck worthy of tier 2, tier 1, or even rogue? No, I think that this deck is actually trash. And again, that's not to say that I think that you can't win with this. It's just that most of the experience that I've had with stall burn in this format is that you can get so close to actually killing your opponent with the burn strategy, but you just don't have enough ways to get that last bit of damage in at the very end there. And drawing the burn cards are basically kind of bricks until the end of the game. So I think that the deck suffers from consistency issues. It suffers from actually closing out the game. And if your opponent does know that you are on burn, then they can very easily play around it. So for all these reasons, I think that stall burn is actually trash tier. You know, burn fans, don't at me here. I'm not saying that trash tier decks aren't fun to play, because burn can definitely be fun to play, especially if you actually manage to pull it off. But I do think that it's one of the worst unique sort of strategies in the format. Next up, we have Fusion. And when I think of Fusion, I generally think of Metal Dragon Turbo, because I do think that Metal Dragon is the best of the sort of Fusion strategies. Guy the Dragon Champion may have a lot more attack, but, you know, you need to play more bricks to actually facilitate it. Whereas Metal Dragon, you can play Last Will to bring your fusion materials out of the deck a bit easier. 1850 is still a very respectable attack. They can get over a Lodgin and the like. So I do think that Metal Dragon Turbo is the way to go with this deck. And remember, I actually did win the game for Metal Dragon Turbo that I played on the channel. So does that mean that I think Fusion is a competitive deck? Well, no, because the games that I won with Fusion didn't actually pull off the combo. I won through basically the merits of Last Will Turbo, and I think that's kind of damning for the Fusion deck. So because of that, and because I think that when you actually do manage to bring up Metal Dragon, it's not the most impressive thing in the world, and it can die to like a Fissure or just any removal like that, I think that Fusion actually goes in trash tier instead of rogue. Even though, like, you know, Dragons, it does have an explosive turn when you actually manage to pull it off. Unlike Dragons, I think that it's a lot more fragile. And I also think that, you know, it's just really not worth it. So I'm going to put this in trash. I think it actually goes above stall burn. Just because I feel like you can win off the merits of the Last Will Turbo section of the deck, at least the version that I played of it, more often than you can generally win with stall burn. So I do think it's trash, but I'm going to put it at the top of trash tier. Next up, we've got Dark Equip. And, you know, I had a bit more success with this deck on the channel than I did Earth Equip. So, you know, even though the strategies are very similar, does this mean that I'm going to put Dark Equip in a higher tier, like maybe tier 2? Or will I just put it in Rogue above Earth Equip? Well, something to keep in mind in the game that I played and won on the channel was that I did win against Backrow Control, which is not the best deck in the format by a long way. And so while I do think that Dark Equip is better than Earth Equip, because I think that those 1600 monsters that you run in the deck are a lot better than the 1500 monsters that you run for Earth, I still think that it's not quite tier 2. And, you know, maybe if I did have a tier 1.5 to put things like Last Will and some other very strong decks in the format, maybe I would put this in tier 2. But based on the rankings that I've established for the other decks that I've shown off so far, I do think that Dark Equip is Rogue. It's definitely above Earth Equip, and I think that the deck is better than Dragons. But again, Dragons is just so typical of Rogue. It's the perfect Rogue deck that I'd feel weird taking its top spot and giving it to Dark. So I'm going to put Dark Equip in Rogue slightly under Dragons, even though I do think that Dark Equip is the better deck when you compare the two. It's just Dragons is such a Rogue deck. It's the perfect Rogue deck. So I got to keep that at the top. And also as a note, if you are planning on using one of the Dark Equip deck lists that I've featured on the channel, Please definitely use the second one that I featured, which is made by Hexproof Project. I think it's a lot better than the first one that I featured. And it's a really fun deck when you can actually manage to pull off the combo. And even if you can't, just bring out a bunch of 1600 attackers. It's still pretty fun. So, Dark Equip goes in Rogue. Next up, we've got Soul Control. And Soul Control is, in my opinion, and this might be contentious, I think Soul Control is actually the best deck in the format as it stands now. So, there's sort of a running meme in the Yugi-Kaiba community where people say, well, we're playing this format, but we all secretly know that Stall Mill is the best deck in the format. It's just that not enough players are degenerate enough to play it. And while there is some truth to this, as Stall Mill is not super widely played despite how good it is, I actually think that Soul Control is a bit better than Stall Mill. And part of that is because I think Soul Control has the best matchup against Stall Mill in the format. Stall Mill really wants to build up a defensive board of 2k defenders, and Soul Control's whole thing is removing your opponent's monsters with Soul Exchange and bringing out a powerful tribute monster in its place. So, it's kind of a double whammy for Stall Mill, because Stall Mill's losing its defenders, and also you're gaining a monster that can beat over its defenders. So I think Soul Control actually is better than Stall Mill. And I think that Soul Control is just generally the best deck in this format because the removal that Soul Exchange provides is extremely strong. And to top that off with getting a powerful monster that a lot of other decks can have a lot of difficulty dealing with, I think that Soul Control is actually the best deck in the format. And that's not to say that it doesn't have any flaws or that it doesn't have any bad matchups, because the deck is known to brick pretty frequently on either tribute monsters that you don't have a Soul Control or a Change of Heart for, or Soul Exchanges that you don't have a tribute monster for. But I think at the end of the day, despite its bricking, I still think it is the best deck in the format, although it's definitely not tier 0. Next up, we have Backrow Control, represented by our friend the Stern Mystic here. And I've shown this off in my last couple videos, like in the duel with Janjo, who played it very well, and also in the duel against Sumo Kami, who also played it very well, with maybe a different list. I don't actually know. I didn't get Sumo Kami's list after that. But both those duelists really showed off the deck extremely well and gave it a very good showing. So, where do I think this deck falls in the ranking here? Well, I think it actually falls under trash. And it's iffy where exactly in trash it will go. I'm actually going to put it at the bottom of trash tier. Now, why am I doing this? I did say that, Sumo Kami and Janjo both did excellent jobs piloting the deck and showed it working very competitively, which is very true. They're both great duelists and they both did the deck great service in those games. However, Backrow Control didn't actually take any of those games. I'm not just talking about matches. I'm talking about just any of the games themselves. And I think that speaks to a major problem that, Backrow Control has, which is that, sure, you can learn about your opponent's back row and even potentially remove back row threats, but the deck lacks ways to follow up on that. So even if you're able to deprive your opponent of some resources, your opponent can just out-aggro you and potentially kill you. You just don't have enough aggressive follow-up. So I think that Backrow Control has a really tough time winning games, even though it can pull off its strategy decently well. And so that's why I'm putting it at the bottom of trash tier, under Stall Burn. Maybe this is kind of flexible. Maybe it can rise above Stall Burn or even Fusion. But I think that it's just one of the worst decks in the format, despite being very cool to play. And so that's why it's going to be in trash. Next up, we have Umi Beatdown, which is a very cool deck featuring Great White and Umi. Umi buffs up the Great Whites to 1800, and that can be good enough. Just playing 3 extra copies of Lodge in your deck is pretty good. The deck can also play Ultimate Offering, which is very nice. And so where does this deck relate to the other tribal decks and just to the other decks in the format in general? Well, even though I put the other tribal decks in Rogue, I actually think I'm going to put Umi Beatdown at the bottom of tier 2. And my reason for this is that Umi Beatdown generally only plays one copy of Umi, which means that there's only one real hard brick in the deck. Whereas things like Dark Equip and Earth Equip, they both have to play multiple equip spells, which can be bricks in the hand if you don't have monsters to equip them to, or you have a situation where you don't really want to equip your equip spells to a given monster. Umi, on the other hand, you know, you're only playing one copy of it probably, and you know, once you play it, it's there. Your opponent could have a D-Spell. D-Spell is a card that pops up in the format. But if they use D-Spell on Umi, I don't actually think that's that bad of an outcome for you. You know, that means that your more powerful spells have not been dealt with by D-Spell. And being able to chain Ultimate Offering to Umi, I think gives the card value outside of just, you know, increasing Great White's attack. So I think that this deck is bottom of tier 2. It's almost in Rogue, but I think that it can put up a good fight against a lot of decks in the format. And just in general, it's less bricky than the other sorts of tribal decks. And now we've come to the last deck in the format that I want to talk about, which is Worm Control, also occasionally known as Worm Burn. This is a deck that I've featured a lot of on the channel, because this deck I kind of view as kind of like my baby. Other people have experimented with the deck before in the format, but I didn't really see many people playing this deck, or at least going as all in on it as my build of the deck do. And I call this Worm Control, but I think it's more accurately called Ultimate Offering Control. Basically, worms are very nice because you don't have to commit much to the field, but the deck really revolves around Ultimate Offering, using it to bring out monsters during your opponent's battle phase to clear the way for things like Worm or your other monsters to get in for a lot of damage, and hopefully you'll out-aggro your opponent before they can put up a resistance. Worm Control also is a great matchup against Soul Control, which is one of the best decks in the format, as I mentioned. Wicked Worm Beast can get around Soul Exchange pretty well, and so if your opponent's bricking on Soul Exchanges or Change of Hearts, then just having a Worm Beast in hand, bringing it out every turn to attack in, can be really, really good. So where do I think that this deck falls? I think it falls in a very similar place as Last World Turbo. I think that it has the potential to be a tier 1 deck, but it's very, very underexplored. I think more people are exploring it now, which I'm very happy about. But until people really, you know, tinker with it more and we get more eyes and minds on it, I think that this deck is just top of tier 2 in the sort of tier 1.5 range that Last World Turbo would be. But, you know, I think that in a couple months or years, I think that Wicked Worm Beast Control or Last World Turbo could easily rise up to tier 1. And it'll be exciting to see if that actually does happen. So maybe in the future, I'll update this tier list with my later thoughts on the format, because the format does evolve somewhat, you know. It's largely solved, I think, but, you know, every tournament that happens gets new innovation in these decks, and certain decks like Dragons, I think there will always be innovation around because that deck is so tantalizingly close to being broken, I think. But for now, this is going to be my tier list of the decks in Yugi-Kaiba format. Of course, this is just my opinion after playing a lot of games with these decks on my channel and in the Format Library Discord. You are definitely free to think that this is just abjectly wrong and disagree with my takes here. And I'd be curious to see what you all think in the comments down below. If you liked this video, be sure to actually like it on YouTube and also consider subscribing. As I've said before, I'm planning on moving into Critter format for the near future, but I don't think I'll ever stop making Yugi-Kaiba format content. So if you want to keep updated when I release these videos, please subscribe It helps out the channel a lot, and you'll also be able to see when these videos come out. But until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.